Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the next ReGen Ag Chat. My name is Genever, and we have Nick Renison here as well. So, Nick, what have you been up to?
Mainly dealing with ill children in the last 24 hours. That's why I'm a bit groggy. But we're busy carving. We're probably 3/4 of the way through. And we were just talking about it this morning, actually. So last carbon calling last year, Reno went on the Greg Judy's course on the Sunday and loved it. And it gave him the confidence to carve in rotation. So we've now probably on about day 20, 3/4 of the way through, maybe. 80 cows being moved every day, and it's working really well. Just a couple of minor hiccups, but that is good, and it's really helping with our grass growth. So money well spent with Greg, and it's been very growy here, and we've had a few days at the helm wind. But the news today, Liz, is finally the carbon calling website is up and running. Ta-da! Yep. Thanks to my sister. Now, you lot are the first to know on the call, but it's carboncalling.farm, and tickets are on sale. It's just gone live today. There will be mistakes on it, so if you find any mistakes, just quietly tell us. And we haven't got all the speakers' bios up yet, but we're going to quietly be feeding them onto it. Yeah, so have a look around that. And Liz, I'm loving your
t-shirt. And a new t-shirt.
Explain.
So this is we love a t-shirt, and we're developing some for sale at the conference in September. So this is version 1, and a friend of mine found this quote, and I thought it was ideal to explain Nick and myself's approach to life. So it says, keeping it awkward, brave and kind. I have to sometimes I'll have to walk it and go, and kind. The kind bit doesn't come naturally. The other bits all over.
And then on the
it's
back,
from Brene Brown. Might not work.
Carbon calling. Yeah.
And the website.
So yeah, we're thinking we might get a few more quotes. So if anyone's got a really good quote, but I'm loving the awkward. It's my middle name.
Yeah. Well, the suggestion has been putting the cults into agriculture, but maybe we'll see.
It's quite a strong word, isn't it?
Yeah.
But Liz, the other thing I was going to ask you about is worms.
Yeah.
With your funny gyno glove on, you had on the
to clarify,
finger. Go on.
I nearly cut the top of my finger off cutting onions for a barbecue, for a burger bar, and I didn't really want to get it infected by worm, even though I'm sure it's magical stuff and has healing properties. I was wearing a glove, and for some reason this is what she's concerned, like thinking I've gone wimpish. It wasn't. It was just being health and safety minded. And if I didn't put the video on if I did it without a glove, people have moaned. So I was in a lose-lose situation.
Lose-lose.
But yeah, so workshop with Anna, who we chatted with 2 months ago, I think. That's Wednesday. So there's a group of us coming together to learn all about vermicomposting. I'm reading the book so I can be a proper geek.
You've gone quite geeky on this.
I know. I really like it. I don't know why.
Why?
I just think it's the fact is that they're reducing waste and they're developing something that's useful and it's sellable. I know I'm sounding like some sort of pyramid seller, but there's just quite a lot of ways of the benefits are huge, and I don't understand why it's so popular in so many countries and we just don't do it. So that also intrigues me. So when I've had my wormeries critiqued tomorrow, I might not be quite so
critiqued by Anna.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you got any worms? Is there worms there?
Yeah, I went in the other day and checked. So I've got worms in the nicest possible way. But yeah, so I've got some that are on food waste and some that are on a mixture of horse and cattle manure. So 2 separate systems, as she described the other week. Sorry. So yeah.
So I put worms in the same category as biochar, because it's a bit.
What a good link there, Nick.
What a good link. It's a bit out there, isn't it? And we it's probably, we don't know anything about it. It's a bit mysterious. So welcome, Donna.
Hi guys.
So this evening we're going to focus on biochar, and I think I gave the title, is it a miracle or is it a gimmick? So the background, I was doing a podcast for Farmers Weekly, and there was loads of questions on biochar. So I did a standard thing and like Googled a paper and read it just beforehand and said all of these miracle things that biochar did and didn't. Donna very fortunately was on the call, and then we had a chat afterwards and just gave me a slight reality check on what it can and can't do, particularly on UK soils. So I thought it was just a useful conversation to have, because I know a few people thinking about using it here, and this is not about saying thou shall never use it. It's just using it with knowledge, isn't it? Which is what we're trying to get from this evening's chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose we should start with, what is it?
So biochar is a form of charcoal, but we've made it in a certain way, and it's for a certain purpose. And that purpose is not to throw in your barbecue, unfortunately, but to put it in the soil. Because if you put it in your soil, you will have captured that carbon for a very long time. But the problem is with biochar is that, yes, a certain amount of it will stay in your soils. It is therefore a climate change mitigation tool, because you capture that carbon. It's no longer CO2. Your plants have done that for you. You have pyrolyzed those plants, that wood or whatever, and you've changed a lot of that carbon into a form that can last for millennia. And that's the upside of biochar. And that's why we're interested in it as farmers, but also as a potential carbon credit scheme. But the reality is that carbon framework exists in two general forms. One is not generally attackable by microbes, and that's the form we want to keep, and that's the form that stays around forever. But the other form is kind of oily, and in fact in some biochars you can actually feel how oily it is, and that is made up of compounds, carbon compounds, that are easily degraded by microbes. And of course, if it's degraded by a microbe, then they effectively respire or breathe that carbon back out into as CO2. So you haven't captured that carbon. And because that carbon form is easily degraded, you've also shifted the microbial life and diversity in your soils. And that has other repercussions for yield. And that is why, in some cases, your yield can drop by nearly 28%. That's what some papers have found. So it can increase your yield, but it depends where you are, what you're growing, and what your soil is like.
So a couple of things to unpack in that. So if farmers say they're cutting down or pollarding some trees or hedges, so can people produce their own biochar easily on farm as a way of capturing extra carbon?
Absolutely, they can. And they can do it with relatively simple kit. An easy Google search will help them find the right kit. What they want to do when they are making their biochar is ensure that they exclude nearly all or most of the air, because we're not interested in burning your wood or pollard waste. Burning happens in oxygen. And if you do that, what you do is you'll end up with ash, and you'll have burnt off all the carbon. So you need to carbonize it. And in order to carbonize it, you need to reduce your oxygen. And you can do that with the kilns you would find traditionally in the woods. You'd need a lot of knowledge to do it. It's a highly skilled job. But also there are certain pyrolysis kits. They're quite small, quite cheap, and quite friendly to use. And they're available on as a result of any Google search. So definitely a good idea, something to valorize your waste with. Either you use it or you sell it.
And then, so if you bought it in or then made your own, so then you're applying it to land, and is that just a spreading? Does it have to be incorporated? I suppose it can, or just surface application is fine?
We could do, probably would be better incorporated because we find it works at different ways at different root depths. But again, it depends on what you're growing and it depends on your soils. So more sandy soils will react differently to a biochar application than would a clay soil. And I've spent a bit of time on discovering different ways of doing this. So again, I hate to say as a scientist, it depends, but I'm afraid it rather does. So you just need to incorporate it. If you can incorporate it anyway, because obviously the less work and tractor passes you have, the better. But it really depends on what you're trying to do with it, to be honest.
Okay. And then, so there was the third bit. So in terms of if it's then, so the idea is it's going into an inactive form of carbon, isn't it? But
Yeah.
then you were saying it could be transformed within the soil by microbial activity and then shift again.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But there are other things that biochar does, and this is why the scientific community was so excited about it. So if, for instance, you completely stripped your biochar of any of that edible carbon or any other minerals or any volatile organic compounds or anything like that, anything that could influence plant growth, it would still influence plant growth because, for instance, what it does is the biochar is like a hard sponge then, and it provides a network of different sized pores, which bugs in your soil absolutely love. So some of the bugs work for you, the bacteria work for you, and some work against. But the bacteria that work for you, or microfauna or whatever, can be protected from the bacteria and other little bugs that eat those things. So they can be protected from predation. They can be protected from dehydration, because all of those little tubes that biochar provides also protects them from dehydration as well. And so you end up with things like extra amounts or extra long hyphae from a fungal I knew I was going to lose my word today. So from mycelium and basically organisms like that. So you can get all this extra root. So if you've got
almost.
Thank you. Yeah. So what's basically happening is you've got all these microbes working in your favor in some cases, and that helps then support your root system, which means you can increase plant growth and crop yield. But again, that depends on the soil and the genetic diversity of the microbes that you have in that soil.
So if you potentially, so you would think a sandy soil generally low in organic matter.
Yeah.
So that the addition of biochar would help in terms of habitats for, if that's the right word, for basically microorganisms that live in the soil. Yeah. So that's why it differs. It just depends on whether there's already habitat or something or surfaces they like living in or on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then because the conversation we had also was this, like there's huge amount of evidence of positives, isn't there, from tropical soils or application onto tropical soils?
Yeah, there is, and in tropical soils, exactly for the reasons we've just been talking about, because there is an addition of organic matter of surface area. Bear in mind, all biochemical reactions, whether or not they're microbially mediated, need some kind of surface area and some kind of hydration. Anything that improves that is going to improve the microbial diversity in your soil. And if that goes up, then generally speaking, your crop yield goes up as well. Now, the issue with UK soils is because we have better soil organic matter levels and a different diversity of microbes. What happens is that if you start feeding all of these microbes really, really lovely edible carbon, which is what biochar contains when you first put it in, then that microbial growth goes through the roof, which is great. But of course, what it's doing is also drawing all the nutrients, particularly nitrogen, several forms of nitrogen from the soil, which means you get nitrogen tie-up. So as a result of considerable microbial growth in your soil, your crop yield again goes down in UK soils. But this doesn't happen in all soils.
Okay, so it's back to that, knowing the purpose that you're using it or applying it for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And have you got sort of examples or cases from areas in this country where they have used it with benefits or not?
Yeah, so I've done it myself. So we got, I'm trying to caveat this, but as I go. So I did a wheat trial with biochar and digestate. So I compared biochar, digestate and biochar and fertilizers. And what I found was my wheat crop, my wheat productivity, my wheat yield went down when you compared my biochar along with control against fertilizers. So biochar on its own didn't make up for a chemical fertilizer, which you wouldn't expect it to. Biochar, to be clear, is an amendment, not a fertilizer. It doesn't contain enough NPK and those kind of useful chemicals. But what did do better actually than the chemical trials were the biochar and digestate. So that did work better and resulted in quite a positive result. But if you're going to use biochar, you cannot use it alone if what you're driving at is yield. If you also want to include a wider set of parameters to kind of score against, then biochar could be useful for you. But one of those parameters, for instance, might be some kind of carbon scheme or some carbon credit scheme or stuff like that. It's never going to be just about yield in the UK.
But it's also the potentially, but could be used in conjunction with digestate or other sort of highly available nitrogen sources as a way of sort of making them less leaky, perhaps, if want of a better. Is that how it works, or is it just what do you think the mechanism was in that with digestate?
Yeah, so what we think was the digestate worked better than the chemical fertilizers anyway, because it offered a far better range. I put exactly the same amount of nitrogen on in terms of nitrate, but digestate offered a whole other number of cofactors that also meant that yield grew up, the yield increased. What we felt the biochar did was hold on to some of those cofactors and minerals and whatever it is digestate offered, so that it lasted longer in the soil. So from one hit of fertilizer, given on one date, at the end of that trial, with no other hits of fertilizer having been applied, the biochar and digestate outperformed the chemical trial.
So it sort of made it into more slower release type approach.
Yeah, we think so. We think that would have been one of the mechanisms.
Okay.
So Donna, can you just take us back a step to a bit about you and why biochar, and your kind of thoughts on the whole big question, but the whole kind of sustainable regenerative movement, really, and the way we farm generally.
Okay, cool. So I come from a commercial farming background, very small scale though. We had just sheep and cattle and a few oats and that kind of thing, and we all worked off farm as well. So we ran it as a 3-generation family, and that was my childhood really. So I was always influenced by that, and we were using chemical fertilizers up until they were too expensive to use, and then my grandfather decided he wasn't going to go that way, and we stopped using the chemical fertilizers, and we just had less sheep. So actually it balanced out about the right, about the same. So we sold not quite as much, but then our input cost was far less, and that's always influenced me really, because what I thought I would discover when I was doing all my research was that biochar and digestate used in combination would be this fantastic answer. I thought biochar would be amazing on its own, but actually that just isn't the case in the UK. And I am really passionate about coming up with an answer for sustainable methods and mechanisms of farming that actually have an upside for the farmer too, and eventually will not need any kind of carbon credit scheme or subsidy support. So I'm thinking of starting a conversation and a development of a methodology over the next 20 years. This isn't a quick hit. And I think that is the issue with biochar. I feel that it has been sold as, you know, this miracle cure, this one hit wonder, you know, we just carbonize a load of stuff, we put it in the soil, there's no real consequence one way or the other, but in fact there are negative consequences, and we certainly can't guarantee positive consequence. And I don't think it's fair to ask farmers to take the risk for that. So my approach with biochar and with other sustainable methods of farming and methods that increase soil organic matter and carbon in the soil is to find ways that are palatable for farmers here and now, in as far as I can, but also ensure some kind of acceptable or reasonable approach to mitigating climate change. So that really then leads into my conversation and my knowledge of ReGen Ag, and really about starting that conversation, but being really realistic. What we're trying to do is not easy. It involves a lot of knowledge. It involves a lot of risk. We would prefer it if you didn't have to use a chemical in order to resolve a wheat fungal issue or something like that. But at the same time, people need to pay their mortgages. And if you're having to take that risk and you need to grow things in a different way, and again, that's about risk, that's about knowledge. So I can advise farmers and do advise farmers up to a point, but I'm really conscious of the fact that I can advise one farmer one thing, walk around the side of a hill, and then all the parameters are off. So you have to learn again. So what we do at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, that's at Coventry University, is try to provide a framework through which farmers can learn and be supportive as well. I'm upset and angry about the amount of stick farmers are getting at the moment. We appear to be blamed for everything, and I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think it's justified. So I'm trying to come up with slow, long-term answers that work for everyone, and that really is my approach to this.
So in overseas, what's the situation with biochar overseas? Is there any? Oh,
yeah, so it is. It's got much more in the way of legs overseas. Certainly in tropical areas with poorer soils, putting biochar on can have a huge influence on plant on crop yield. So, for instance, there are case studies, I'm looking at a few now, that have increased yield by 39%. But they will be incredibly poor soils, and you could put anything on. Compost, if you put that on, that could also be amazing. But of course, the advantage that biochar offers over compost is that even though a certain amount of it will respire off as soon as you put it in, nearly all your compost will disappear far quicker than biochar does. So overseas, there's far more excitement about it, far more use. There's a far more short-term instant advantage for our farmers, so that's really, really good. And also, of course, there's the long-term advantage for the rest of the planet in that some of that biochar, quite a decent chunk, will be back in the soils where we need it to be and out of the air where it's not too useful at the moment.
And is this people, big companies making biochar and then selling it, like it's like become a commodity? Is that the story?
Yeah, to a certain degree that is. What companies are trying to do is, for instance, I'm working with a company that's trying to think of what to do with its waste product. So this is in terms of valorizing waste. So if they've got loads of cocoa bean nut shell, I think it was the last company I spoke to, and they have tons of organic waste. And they want to sell it as, as biochar, and they are looking for it to be this fantastic stuff. And of course, in some countries it can be. But when they ask for research to be undertaken in this, I always have to be a little bit careful with regard to what I promise, because the answer again is it depends. And it's also incredibly interesting because your feedstock for your biochar is hugely influential with regard to how it operates in the soil. So animal manure biochar works in a completely different way to wood-based biochar, for instance, because not least because the animal manure biochar supplies a lot more in the way of minerals that are useful for crop yield often. So it depends who you talk to, what they're up to, but there is a huge push to valorize waste that we've got anyway, and I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions about your trial, or one came in terms of who was it funded by, or sort of what, I'm guessing it wasn't, I suppose to check it wasn't funded by a biochar company.
No, it was just funded by Coventry University. So it's a teeny tiny trial, just to it's like a pump priming fund. So from that paper, then I could go out and try and get more funds elsewhere. It's actually extremely difficult to get funding for biochar trials that are at field scale level, because they're so expensive and they're quite risky and difficult to run. But I'm still looking.
And was the wheat conventionally drilled, or was it? I'm guessing it was in plot, so it was. Or how was the wheat established? I think so. No-till or conventional, cultivated.
It was all conventional. I really wanted it to work within that framework, because if the biochar had worked within that framework, I really would have had something to shout about. But everything was done conventionally.
And then another question of, so sort of wider than your research findings, but if you use digestate 1 year with biochar, and then the next year, if you can't get any digestate, will the land degrade? So does it stick, I suppose, is the question. Does it need this constant feeding? It's like a fertilizer though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so I think biochar could potentially, again, it depends on your soil, make a bit of difference and hold on to it from one season to the next. Certainly, I've seen some grassland experimentation where the biochar, it does still appear to be influential the following year and the year after that, but on the third year, that any difference between biochar treated soil and control has virtually disappeared. But again, it depends how much you put on, what you're growing in it, and what additional fertilizing you're adding.
And then this a very interesting the question, which is how much biochar is too much on land?
My instant response as a farmer is more than you can pay for, is way too much. But you can put too much on, as in see a yield drop, and I cannot give you a straight answer to that, I'm sorry, because it really does depend on your soil. So I have seen experiments when they put equivalent of 100 tons per hectare on. That would be incredibly expensive, as you can imagine. But also in some soils, what that would cause for that year is nitrogen tie-up, because it would feed too many of the, you'd see too much microbial growth as a result of the edible part of the carbon, and they will just suck up all the minerals out of the soil for that year. So you can have too much, and too much can be a lot less than 100 tons per hectare, depending on your soil type and your microbial diversity.
But when you say there'll be a yield drop, is that a yield drop in maybe years 2 and 3, and then does it rise? Is there...
It would. I think recover would probably be a better term. So yes, it does come back, because that initial hit of edible carbon does fade away, because obviously the microbes shoot through it. How fast that would occur, the recovery rate, again, would depend on environmental conditions such as, rain, temperature, stuff like that, as well as the diversity in your soil and your soil type and what you're growing.
And when you talk about the cost, say if you thought, I want to go and buy 2 tons of biochar.
Yeah.
Somebody on the call might have done that. You haven't, have you, Liz? Too busy with your worms. But how much is it?
I have no idea. I've never had a bid where I can actually go out and buy 2 tons of biochar. But again, it depends where you get it from and what the biochar is.
Someone on a group I'm in got a quote for £800 a ton. That was in small bags, and that was from South Africa. But that was also palletized, like prilled, so it could be used in a third sprint spinner.
£800 a ton. That's quite chunky, isn't it?
Especially when we don't know whether it actually works.
Well, yes, but you've got to be really careful how you define the word work. If you want it to work as a climate change mitigation, then it will do. If you want to see some yield that year, then it may not, but it depends where you are.
And I suppose because I I'm involved in a project where I do some carbon footprinting with AgriCount, which is it's now spun out of Scottish Agricultural, but they have an option of biochar application. So it is often seen, isn't it, as a climate change mitigation option.
Yeah.
Yet to find anybody who's actually got anything to put in that tab, but it's there as a well recognised way of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I suppose then we know whether there'll be, it could be that there'll be some subsidy or some involvement with carbon schemes where some of that money is being offset, isn't it? Or the yield income foregone, for example, type approach for the yield that's being lost in that in the first year or so.
Yeah, and that's what we need to work out is what kind of subsidy regime would support the farmers such that any yield loss would be mitigated and any cost of producing or buying the biochar would be mitigated as well. But that's actually far more complicated an equation than it sounds.
So fundamentally, it's not, well, other than yield, it's not like there's a buildup of heavy metals like you get with some digestates or sewage sludge, is it? So it's not gonna long term. There's no residue that's going to hurt the soil. It just has that initial yield penalty because of the stimulation of the microbiome, basically.
That's certainly the case with the wood-based biochar that I've experimented with and done a lot of reading around. However, people are now, pyrolyzing bananas. So I wouldn't actually like to say biochar, across the board isn't going to cause problems because I just don't know the answer to that. But certainly from the common biochars, if you like, the ones that are more freely available, the wood-based ones should be okay in the longer term. And that's certainly what's happened with terra preta. Are you guys familiar with that and why biochars become interesting right now?
No.
Okay. So terra preta are the black soils that are found in Amazonian jungles, or some of them. And this is really what inspired the biochar research. And terra preta is biochar soils, basically. And they started checking out the burnt bits, but also accidentally pyrolyzed bits, along with the fresh organic matter about 500 years ago or something like that. And those soils therefore increased in organic matter and increased in nutrient levels. And so you've got these pockets of terra preta, black earth, around dwellings centuries ago. And those soils are still far more fertile than the surrounding soils. So when scientists began to try to work out why you were getting these pockets of fertility, this is when they found the charcoal bits and pieces, and this is when they began to work out the influence of biochar. But that biochar, that charcoal, was never thrown on the ground on its own. It was always accompanied by other organic matter as well. So what we would do in this day and age is that would be forms of digestate or food waste or whatever.
Sorry, Nick, we're just going back to a point of clarification. So there's a question about the idea of it being sequestering carbon, because if you basically pyrolyze it, that's a word. It is, but not the pronunciation, a carbon source, and put it into the ground. How can it be classed as removal is the question.
Removal of carbon from the air, do you mean? Yeah,
so it has, I suppose it's been used by the hedge or the tree or whatever. Do you mean it's been captured, hasn't it, as CO2 by that, and then you're locking it into inaccessible form?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So photosynthesis requires CO2. So the plant transforms that into a form that it can use in order to build itself. And then when you pyrolyze that plant, wood or whatever, you carbonize it, then you change the structure of that carbon compound into one that is resilient to microbial attack. It is therefore able to stay in the soil in that form for, in some cases, millennia. But it's not, it's not one form of carbon that it changes into. It's multiple forms, and some of those forms are resistant to microbial attack. And therefore hang around, and others aren't, and therefore get respired straight back out the soil.
So that word beginning with P,
pyrolysis.
Burn.
Is that just what it is? Burn without oxygen?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. Well, it's not burning, because burning is with oxygen.
Burning, yes.
It is moving. So it carbonized. You could that, if that would help, that you could use that. So it's literally is heated in the absence of air or oxygen, heated to a very high degree. And that heating mechanism is also incredibly important, because you can have the same feedstock for your biochar and produce a very different biochar according to what temperature and pressure parameters we use within your kiln.
So haven't we got anyone making it in this country? So when you said it came in from, where was it coming from? There's South Africa. You're in your group.
Yeah, it's South Africa, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Yes, we do have UK biochar makers. Yeah, quite big organisations and are really trying to, make way with this technology.
There's just a few more questions. So, how does biochar behave or react with synthetic fertilizer? Did the work you did you have a biochar plus element?
We didn't look for a reaction in terms of what happens at the kind of chemical level, if that makes sense. We just looked for an output, and the output was that we couldn't find a difference between biochar and the fertilizer on its own, or there wasn't much of one anyway. So there may well be a reaction. There's not one that we discovered at the time.
So, but I suppose it could have a what's the word I'm looking for? God,
I passed it on.
It's not. It's. I'm just thinking of what people are using humates, for example, with different fertilizers and sort of plant protection products to sort of help mitigate some of the more negative effects of some of those products. So I suppose it might have some of that impact, mightn't it? It might help.
Yeah, potentially. It certainly has quite an absorptive. That one of the good and bad things, whatever you want to call it, about biochar is it has a really highly absorptive surface area, so that absorption capability really influences how it influences plant growth and microbial growth. So for instance, one of the downsides, depending on your outlook, is that because it can absorb pesticides, it also inactivates them. So if you put a load of biochar down under your wheat and you use a load of pesticides, you might find they're not as effective. But again, it depends on the biochar type and the pesticide type and what you're growing again. So, but it's certainly something to be aware of, that sort of kind of power, if you like.
And I suppose then the mode of action. So if it's leaf, if the biochar wouldn't be on the leaf, would it? So if the product is active through the leaf, then
yeah. So
it's also
how you applied it
and where its mode of action is. So I suppose because of that absorbent ability of it, there's a question again about being fed to cattle. So using it as a way of taking potential toxic compounds out of their diets. Again, have you seen any work on that?
Yeah, quite a lot of work on this. All small trials, unfortunately, because the cost of these trials can be enormous. So what I did a little bit of an experiment myself, which I'll come to in a minute, but what has been looked at is the amount of methane that has been emitted from cattle when they've eaten biochar, whether or not there are any health benefits, is there better live weight gain, are eggshells stronger, and things like that. So it's been throughout a range of different animals and different stock animals, biochar has been used and analysed. And what we found is that in some cases there can be health benefits, and also there can be, for instance, a decrease in methane emission. But it's likely that methane emission that decrease isn't likely to go on forever, because what you'll find is that your microbiome, having got the biochar in it, it can decrease in emission, but that will then change over time. Within a few weeks, it will bounce back up because it's got used to the new regime that biochar creates. So it isn't. This needs far more research, but there's the caveat that it might not work yet again. I'm trying to think. alpha toxin in milk and in feces can decrease as a result of biochar, and application in certain in poultry and dairy, and all these kind of experiments have added up to there being some indication that it could be useful as a feed. And certainly when one of the farmers that I worked was feeding his own biochar to his cattle, what he was convinced of, we couldn't find evidence for obviously, was that his first and foremost, the cattle actively chose to eat it. We were thinking we would have to mix it with molasses, but absolutely not. They ate the lot. Top dressed with a bit of grain or something like that, but it just wasn't an issue. They were hungry for it, and he felt that his the cattle that were on the biochar mix were calmer and seemed happier and more relaxed, and they ate more as well. So we think in terms of how cattle can react to it, there could be some huge positives. But again, this really needs a lot more research and experimentation, and that's the point at which we get a bit stuck.
And so that, well, there was a comment actually in one of the WhatsApp groups I'm in today, which is about someone's question about there's some sheep eating the bonfire. I know it's burnt, not pyrolyzed. But in terms of only that someone on the chat told me how to spell it, how to say it phonetically. But yeah, they were after basically like ashes, the ash of the from the bonfire where they've been burning some thorns.
Yeah.
But,
there is a lot of evidence that animals will preferentially choose to eat ash or charcoal, actually. And, you know, humans have been using charcoal for millennia to deal with poisonings and upset stomachs. So this isn't news. We're just not quite sure how it would work in production animals.
I think pregnant women eat charcoal, don't they? Don't they crave it or something?
They can do, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what Poppy needed last night, some charcoal.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is quite a bit of evidence floating about it, but again, it's all from tiny trials, and that's what we need to work on. But that would work really well. So the farmer that I work with would certainly use it again. He produced his own biochar because he was running a charcoal producing business, so that was useful. So he was using the kind of bits and pieces you can't, you know, put in your barbecue. His cows, he felt, benefited from it. And then, of course, they went out and they deposited the results of their diet all over the ground, so that there was a kind of extra valorization, if you like, of that product, because it was also spread to the ground, and some of it will be still there now.
And there's another question, which is, the question is, from the results of your trials and the work that you've seen, can you comment on how to optimize fertilizer with biochar applications? Is there work out there that answers that question?
There is a little bit of work out there. You would need to understand your soil. Sorry to caveat it again, but it really does depend on soil type and where you are and what you're trying to grow. But if you take that the person's question, I can try and help find some answers for them. You know, and it will depend in which part of the UK they are. And I can try and see if I can find something for them, but I have to look at a specific trial. There is no generic answer for that.
Okay, thank you. And this idea of good and bad quality biochar, is there any way of understanding what you're buying if you are going to buy it, and how to sort of audit it?
Yeah, so there is the European Biochar Initiative. So you would need to make sure that your biochar, unless it's your own and you're happy with it, complies with that. I can send you those details if you want, Liz. I'll send that to you.
Please.
If anybody want to use them. But if it's being shipped in for somewhere else, as a scientist, I'd want to know quite a bit more about it. I'd want to know if there are any nasties in there, volatile organic compounds that cause you know, some kind of toxicity in the soil to not only microbial life but also your crop as well. I'd want to know what the surface area is. I'd want to know what the cation exchange capacity is. I'd want to know what the ratio is between the recalcitrant carbon and the mineralizable, like easily edible carbon. And I'd want to know what the feedstock is as well. So there'd be a few things I would like to be reassured of before I started chucking it on the ground. So if you went to the European Biochar Initiative, then you would get some kind of not guarantee, but reassurance that it's not too nasty stuff. But you do need to operate with some care, I must admit.
Well, that and just I've just put the link to the European Biochar certificate in there,
That's
and
it.
so in Switzerland you've got to. The certificate is you need to have biochar that's got a certificate for use in agriculture. So,
Yeah.
so this sort of quality control is always more
There
advanced.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And then there was another question just on. Is there anything about, you've mentioned sort of affecting the diversity of the microbiome? Is there any work looking at the diversity of plants or biodiversity above the soil as well as a benefit out from biochar application?
There could well be, but actually I haven't come across that, but I could do a quick search on that to find out. It's not something I looked at because I was just focused on the microbiome at that stage in the soil. But yeah, could be. Shift that.
And then so there's a bit of that question about almost like awakening the seed bank, but that might be driven more by the changing in microbiome, providing a habitat or a food source to the microbiome in the soil anyway.
Yeah, probably, but it's a good question.
There's a very difficult question from Josh. What soil in the UK is best in your view? I'm going to caveat that in terms of which is most responsive to biochar, do you think?
A sandy soil. So anything that needs a little bit of help with organic matter anyway, and it needs to slow down the percolation of water through that soil would benefit from biochar, again, depending on what you were growing. But whether or not you'd be able to actually apply it at a rate that had some kind of reasonable yield effect would be another matter. And that would depend, of course, how much you're paying to either produce it or buy it.
There's a few questions about composting in terms of could we not take the bark or whatever, whatever we're pyrolyzing, still can't say it, into biochar. Could we not just use that within a composting, so wood chip it and compost it, or put it through a wormery? Is there been work on sort of nutrient cycling in those different avenues for the raw materials or not?
Are you suggesting making biochar out of compost? Is that what you're asking?
No, sorry. In terms of, if you say you had a lump of, I want to say, I keep coming back to hedge trimmings, but if you had a load of biomass coming out of the waste timber or whatever out of the timber industry,
yeah,
has there been any work in sort of what's the most effective way of getting those nutrients back into the soil? Is it through biochar? Is it through composting? Is it through worms? That's a difficult question.
I don't know much about worms. Sorry, you will be.
You should have come to my workshop on Wednesday. I'm just saying.
Sorry. I can't answer for that one. But composting, if you want an immediate hit of nutrients on your, with whatever you're producing, then your way to go is composting. But you will lose any carbon from your compost that you've gathered over the next, certainly foreseeable future. Biochar, you don't go to biochar for nutrients, you go to biochar for long-term carbon sequestration in soils. The interesting question would be what would happen if you combine biochar and compost, and there have been some upsides to that. It's not something I focus on because I focus on digestate, but if that person would like me to find a paper for them to see if there's any upside, I can do that for them.
And I think it's this not one or the other, is it? It's a combination that's probably going to be most effective.
Yeah, and that's not really surprising, is it? Because all along we've always wanted something that's easy, simple, and you can just throw it on and walk away. That is never going to happen. That's never worked. Last time we achieved that, it was with chemical fertilizers, and now we're paying the price. So if it's easy, you probably don't want to be doing it. So there will be a combination that we have to work out for your farm or for your garden or horticultural, landscape that is quite complicated, and it will be unique to you. But that is, when you look at what nature provides and how nature works things out, and the complexity of that, it's hardly surprising we're going to have to embrace complexity ourselves. This isn't a silver bullet on its own.
So with when you said you couldn't get, it's difficult to get funding for trials and research, why is that?
Yeah, we don't know. We did, a colleague of mine did some research into this, and the amount of funding for more conventional and one might argue proven techniques is quite huge. And then the amount of funding for agroecological techniques is something like 1 or 2% of that. And that's from, I think that was from European Union figures. So what they want is, it's really difficult to operate inside the framework that's really still supports business as usual. And this is the kind of thing that we're up against. And also there isn't the market to support. If we came up with a silver bullet, that we don't have the market to support it anyway. So I was given a talk a couple of years ago on biochar, and and one of the questions was, what would you want to do? Cut down all the trees to make it? And because we don't have the throughput then for that organic way, that agroecological way of doing it. So there's always a good reason not to support this kind of work, but the reality is we're going to have to.
Because when you think about carbon credits and that area, surely it's kind of a bit of a no-brainer to look into it. So in your, if you had a, how would you see carbon credits and biochar potentially working?
So when I get quite a few phone calls, normally from the London area and normally marketing people, who are saying, we're going to do carbon-friendly milk, or we're going to do methane, low methane milk, or something like that. We understand biochar can help. And then when I kind of come up with the reality of the risk and of the perhaps low returns in certain cases, they don't really want to hear that. So with regard to carbon credits, I think biochar could work if all the downsides to it are also addressed and recognised before you set up a carbon credit scheme that's going to be able to support it. But in order for that to happen, then we're asking somebody to help us by providing the funding that we can do the research so that we can work out what all the downsides are for a range of people, a range of farms, a range of horticultural setups. And that's really, really expensive. So I kind of receive a lot of excited phone calls, and then even though I'm an excited Welsh person myself, I can't help pouring cold water on it, and I don't want to, but there are certain realities around this. And also I think I'm a little bit worried about the focus on carbon. I think if you just focus on that, you may end up not achieving as much as you wish to. I think carbon, the push for climate change mitigation needs to be set within a wider framework of increasing biodiversity. Is well understood now that increased biodiversity also means you increase your ability to sequester carbon. I think they work together hand in hand. And what it does for any schemes is you might not be able to get the carbon in your soils up in the UK quickly, simply because there's a lot of carbon in most soils anyway. But if you are increasing your biodiversity, which given for certain landscapes you certainly can do quickly, then you can be rewarded for that. And those subsidy schemes that are able to take account of all those different parameters, i.e. complexity, are the ones that we need to be supporting and looking at. So I think, just looking at carbon on its own it probably is not such a good idea as looking at carbon in the whole kind of framework of things, because again, if it's too simple, it probably is not going to work in the long run.
Yeah.
So to support that, I'm actually looking at payment by result schemes as we speak. So I'm going to Ireland next month to have a look at their payment by result schemes, and they're looking at biodiversity indicators. So I'm looking at the breadth of biodiversity indicators and therefore how that could increase carbon in soil.
And just on the indicators, can you give me any idea of what those indicators, what you're thinking they might be?
They certainly in this in the Burren and the Hen Harrier project and the Pearl Mussel project, these indicators are all very well established and are working well. So for a given farm in a given area, they will be looking for certain plant life. So they'll be looking for certain species of plants which the farmers can identify themselves, the farming agents as well. And then they will also be looking for plants that they don't want there. So for instance, they don't want certain scrub, bracken, stuff like that. As a result of that increase of biodiversity at that level, there also will be looking for an increase in insects and an increase in birds, and then, you know, in this case, an increase in the hen harrier. So if you manage to maintain or increase a population such as the hen harrier, then the community of farmers is rewarded. It sounds like an amazing scheme. I can't wait to go and see it. But those indicators are quite well established, and I can certainly send them to you and can have a look. And then I know, as a scientist, if that lot's happening, I know there's more carbon going in the soil. And that, I think, is the exciting push from a carbon point of view. And I really feel that embracing that kind of complexity and including farmers in farming that way and being paid that way sounds like a good way to go to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know whether it's also worth, I suppose we've talked a bit about agroecology, and it is a strange word, isn't it, in terms of relatively new, but Coventry as a university was it was up there, wasn't it, with one of the first ones to start doing training on agroecology type work. Do you have any thoughts in terms of what more needs to be done from an education perspective? So not just, well, I suppose farmers, but also people working within the industry to sort of upskill people in this sort of area.
I think this is more profound than that. I think our children need to know about it. We need to be teaching this stuff in schools. We offer an MSc in agroecology, and it'd be really nice, though, to do a whole degree in it, and kind of, as you know, I'm very passionate about the word agriculture. I still think we should be talking about it and using it, because obviously that is my background. But we need to be teaching more sustainable methods of agriculture, teaching and training. So teaching a degree and training on short courses as well. Until that happens, it's going to be very, very difficult for farmers and farming families to have the support and the knowledge and the understanding that they're going to need to shift markets, shift ideas, so that they can transition to more sustainable methods of food production.
But why isn't it happening? That's the bit that the cynical side of me says, when some Harper Adams students came here with their jackets and they were all sponsored by Bayer, that is the cynical side. But surely those is that it?
Yeah, to a certain degree it is. This is the status quo, and people are comfortable with it, and we like cheap food. You know, we are not paying for our food at the till. This is what we haven't got across to people, is that you pay for your food in terms of ill health for you personally, but also for the planet. So because we're not paying the full price for the way we produce food at the till, we're happy for it to go on. And I can completely understand that. I absolutely, need cheap food. I've raised 3 sons. They eat like anything. It's an expensive few months when they all come back from university. It's a disaster for my finances. So, I can completely understand that. But until people understand that for a while, not for always, but for a while, we'll need to pay more for food so that farmers can transition back, I have to say, to more organic and agroecological methods of farming, then that is a reality, is not a palatable one. And also, when you teach agroecology, you teach risk, and then you ask people to accept risk. And we haven't accepted risk for decades. We've done everything in millennia maybe just to mitigate that risk and try to avoid it. So when we preach really about growing any crop you decide, we would be saying, well, you want to steer away from monocultures, and you want to grow, you know, all sorts of different diversity of plants and indeed animals on your farm, so that you mitigate risk. But then what we're also saying is that you will need a wider array of skill sets and of machinery and of people with different skill sets. So then the risk goes up, and the amount of money initially you have to pay goes up as well. So then you put that all together, and then you go and ask the bank manager, like we used to, show my age now, you know, to accept these kind of risks, and people still don't want to do that. They still want to be able to grow one crop, and, you know, if something bad happens, spray it with something. And that's, you know, that if that means that you can pay the mortgage at the end of the year, that's really attractive, and it's staying attractive.
But is there something in continuous, what's it called, CPD?
Continuous professional development.
Yeah, so say if you're a farmer in your 40s, 50s, college was a long time ago, and you think, I really want to kind of start kind of broadening my horizon and just kind of learn about a few different things. There isn't really anywhere to go, is there? I mean, you've probably got to do similar to what we do with Carbon Calling, really. You've got to kind of find your own tribe, really, and
yeah,
go and visit people. But if you're not in an area where there's a particular activity in that, you're a bit stuck, aren't you?
Yeah, you are a bit on your own. There isn't, you know, 10 or 20 recognisable universities that are absolutely selling these courses, or providers that are pushing these courses. So your usual providers are providing courses on your usual stuff, which generally speaking is conventional stuff.
But I think, well, as you say, it's also for, I had a young guy around for a farm walk, and he's really interested in regenerative principles and is looking for somewhere to go to university. And it's like, well, where do you go? Because you're going to go to places where they say it's regenerative, like they're using the phrase, but do they is it really what he's after? It's really it's in this cuspy area, isn't it, at the moment, where
it is. Yeah, but I would hesitate to say that universities or standardized training organizations are the answer to this. I think this kind of more organic way of talking to each other, including each other, is maybe more powerful, certainly just as powerful as more conventional learning. Maybe this organic learning is a better way to do it. The only issue is you kind of feel on your own with it, we do take huge you know, comfort from these massive support structures that we call our university framework and stuff like that. It legitimizes it, I think, if you do a degree, and I'm not sure that that's we should think like that. You know, you don't need a degree to do this stuff. What you need is learning. It doesn't have to be in these kind of standardized, formalized learning routes. But the difficulty is then it's hard to find the support you need.
But some of it is a training in critical thinking, isn't it, or evaluation, or creating those checks and balances. So but that, June, there's techniques within holistic management, there's business techniques in terms of monitoring and planning and all of those, isn't it? And so there are the techniques are out there. It's just it's implementing them onto farm and making sure that someone's there to keep the monitoring going. Yeah,
definitely. Which is not that easy, and there's not that, but there is a support structure to do that, really.
Because I've just recently finished my holistic management training, and it's really an important part of that, which is this monitoring side. Is that we're all talking to farmers who the perception is they're healing the world, but we don't actually have any evidence for that. They feel better for how they're farming that land, but we don't actually know whether they are regenerating their soils, or it also depends on what they're aiming to regenerate. But so within a lot of the stuff I'm doing now with clients is building in some monitoring tools, and then really some of them can be really simple, like 10-minute jobs. It's not like a highly in-depth 42-page document, but I think it is important for us just to keep the checks in place, because
Yeah.
we can just continue down our merry way because it makes us feel better.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So we will have to build the case for regenerative farming and similar techniques over the years to come. So again, this is why I always say this is at least another 20-year project for me. But what we can say now is that what we've done in the past has caused some damage. So we at least have to not do that. So there is evidence that what we did was less than perfect, but we did it for good reason. And now those reasons have changed and we need to operate in a different way. So you do kind of have to hang on to that, I think.
Because Nick, I'd be interested in, because you do quite a lot of speaking in terms of your system, but you must quite often get, but what about feeding the world?
I
And
know.
how do you respond to that?
I say, first of all, you've got to feed yourself, because if you can't feed yourself, feed the world. I just don't think it's our job as a little country to feed the world. And I think that we've got to do what we can here to feed people in this country. And if we go hell for leather on production in this country, I think climate change, we've got to be thinking about climate change. And I just think we're going to have mass migration to these kind of cooler places. And we've just got to do what we can for climate change. And also, if you look at the big exporters of the world, Ireland, Denmark, they haven't got many people in those countries. So we've got this thing that we want to be a massive exporter of lamb and beef, but I don't think I'm not a huge fan of that. I think we need to be growing a lot more veg. We need to, just think a bit more about stuff before we kind of do the NFU line. We need to feed the world. But that's a rabbiting on answer. I wasn't prepared for that, Liz. Can you tell?
But you put me on to Ravenous, didn't you? Yeah, so I'm halfway through listening to that, and that talks about quite a lot of this, doesn't it, in terms of sort of from a food system perspective. So we can, and you just realise it's massive as an issue.
But then, so I have got a bit of a crush on Henry Dimbleby, but when I through my crush for him, I was listening to him he was on a panel. It was like a live panel. And his one thing that I don't agree with, he wants lab grown kind of, when it's grown in a dish, George Monbiot style. And when I asked the question, the nutrients, the micronutrients from that type of production, and there was a scientist there, and she said it would be less nutrient dense. It wouldn't have the nutrients particularly that we need. And then today I was listening to the BBC Food Programme with Dan Saladino, and he's been looking at people eating foraging food and the nutrient density of that food, like eating nettles, like crazy things. But I think most of what we eat, sweeping statement, is not that great. I think it's full of carbs, full of sugar, and Mr. Kellogg's and Mr. Pasta make a lot of money out of it, and we're all getting sick. But so are you enjoying Ravenous?
Yeah, I know. I think it's good. It's interesting, but it's that the risk of echo chamber, isn't it? But he's summarising a lot of ideas into one book. It's good. And I've done foraging event. I'm all over this.
But the thing that I think that the status quo, carrying on as we are, it's just not. It's not working. And lots of farmers are locked into a system, and they're not that happy. A lot of them, they're just like hamsters going round and round and round.
Yeah. So I think it's back to the if you remember the Russ Carrington slide, do you remember the slide he put up, which is what are you regenerating? And some people it is a natural capital question, isn't it? And it is soil. Some of it is about well-being, and it sometimes is about the farmer well-being, the community well-being as well. Well, I think Donna, that always sticks in my head. That slide.
Yeah. I just think back to my parents who, when I was growing up, I'm 47, so quite a lot of years ago, but it was like a nice dairy farm. We employed a few people. It was just quite a harmonious place to be. And we didn't have lots of money, but it wasn't a stress. And there wasn't like, and now they've got a lot of slurry, cows are in on sand, supplying big, massive dairy, ticking boxes. And it's quite a stressful place to be. And I think we're all in quite farmers have got so big, they're in quite stressful businesses. And yeah, I don't think it's good for us. Good for us or producing mass food.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. That's what we feel and we sense and we see as well is, you know, I was talking to one farmer the other day, the other year, in fact, and he said, all I do is farm subsidies. There was no pride in that. And it was a really, you know, it's a miserable statement, isn't it? You know, I'm just doing something just to receive a payment. We've all got to do that. But he certainly wasn't enjoying it. So he was optimizing his subsidy. That it just wasn't fun for him. It ensured that he paid his mortgage and his family absolutely agreed with all that. But other farmers are also ensuring that, and they're still, you know, not happy. And also, these are huge businesses. You know, 150, 200,000 pounds for a piece of kit. That is just bonkers, and we shouldn't be okay with that. So the investment already in keeping the status quo, the financial and therefore psychological investment in keeping the status quo is huge, and this is what we're up against. And so I'm always very gentle about, you know, speaking to conventional farmers, and you know, I would never preach. I'm always going to try to help, because they are locked in, you know, and the psychological lock is bigger probably than anything else, and we do have to deal with that. We have to recognize that.
Yeah. So just before we started, you mentioned so the sciencey bits. You get lots, quite often you get scientists, don't you, on the telly who say we must all have our beef all killed by 12 months because on paper it's the best thing to do. And so where are you on the kind of science and the farmers? I'm guessing you're obviously more the farmer side, but your science colleagues, or generally the science community, where is their understanding of actual farming and farmers on the ground?
Well, our centre is rather unique. So there's a huge number of social scientists. So we try to operate really in the middle. So there is a huge push from us to include farming, include the wider community in farming and food production. So we try to do both. There is huge use in science and huge value in the work that scientists do. But certainly I always try to run field scale trials, and preferably on live farms as well, because you learn a huge amount. I'm no arable farmer, I've never done it, I haven't got a clue about it. So I need that guidance, because if my issue is certainly, I always felt that I can do what you like in the lab, but I'm preaching to the converted, because all I'm doing is producing papers for people that agree with me anyway. And I'm not interested in that. I need my science challenged. And this is what the Centre at Coventry actively encourages. So we think we can come up with a fantastic answer like biochar, and then all the results in terms of crop yield go backwards. So unless we're speaking to people and being influenced by people and just saying, yeah, we'd love to do that. Have you seen the regs that means that we just can't? You know, and did quite a bit of a case in point really is the nitrate vulnerable zone regulations, and the what do one farmer call it? The shit spreading day. So basically that's the day after the closed period. So the closed period as a result of MVZ has resulted in pollution instances, because farmers had to comply with environmental legislation and then whack it all out the day that they can, come hail or shine, because they don't have enough slurry pits to hold it all, you know, from their dairy cattle. So we do have to be listened, we do have to be influenced, and we do try to do that. But I have to say that the feelings and realities of farmers are not always included in some scientific approaches.
And I think it's and I suppose the question that, because of that, at the moment there's quite a lot of the infamous phrase reductionist science is comes out a lot, that scientists aren't interested in understanding this bigger picture, but actually in quite a lot of like designing experiments, trying to control as many variables as possible, isn't it? So you do have to reduce it a bit to try and get or to get close to results that might be scientifically significant.
Yeah.
But the phrase reductionist science is like a trigger for me. I just don't like it as a phrase. But maybe it is appropriate.
It is appropriate, but you've got to pop back out of the lab, we need to find stuff out, and the stuff that we found out about biochar could only have occurred in really well controlled scientific experiments, or it would have done over time in the in the field and in more natural settings, but it would have taken a lot longer, and we might not never have understood why. So it has its place. But it really doesn't matter what I find out about biochar and digestate. If I don't have positive findings in terms of yield, as well as climate change, as well as biodiversity, then because farmers don't have the framework or the current ability, for whatever reason, to be able to use those findings, then they're no good anyway. And environmental legislation can often be quite limiting, as I've just explained. So the reductionist, it does have its place, but you're as a scientist, you always need to be listening, basically.
And I suppose it's also answering relevant questions, isn't it? So it's that intelligence gathering bit. And also from and the other word that's triggering to me is the dumbing down. So that's phrases always used when we're sort of thinking about how to communicate to farmers, and it's about a dumbing down exercise. It's not. It's making it accessible.
Yeah.
Very different. Do you mean it's, and also engaging in a way that a lot of the idea that projects are going to go on for 15 years and we might not get a final result isn't it very fascinating for quite a lot of practically minded people who want to know what to do now.
Yeah. And that is the challenge we face as scientists. We need to communicate very, very well, but it's not always easy. And I tell you what, if I've spent 6 months in a lab, and I have done, and I can't talk anymore, I can't speak to people. So I know I remember once I put a couple of paragraphs together and gave it to one of my colleagues to write as part of the bid, and he said, "That's absolute gobbledygook. You know, speak English, woman." So I had to rewrite it, because you get into the habit of using this terminology, and you forget how to communicate. If you've been in a lab coat for 6 or 12 months, you get to talk. So you have to pop in and out and basically talk to people and talk to farmers. And so I quite like when I'm writing bids for farmers to have an influence straight away, because I've got a lot of friends that are farmers, and obviously my family are farmers as well. So in order to write the bids and get the money with the right context, and they are always a group of people I go to first.
So back to quickly go back to biochar. Say you just thought, I'm just going to try a bit of biochar, I'm going to feed it to some cows. And you got yourself a little biochar maker. Yeah. Chucked it in there. Could you quite quickly, how long does it take? I mean, I just haven't got a clue.
I think when we did it as part of an experiment that we run, it was not long. Within a week or two. I'll ask him now, actually, because the experiment was quite a few years ago. But what you can, there are already, and I'll send you a link for these biochar makers that do produce biochar for animal consumption. So I would probably advise you use that first, because that will have been analysed and you absolutely do not know what you're putting in your charcoal maker or what parameters you're using in order to make it. So I'll just put that in quickly. But yeah, if you're going to see a result, if you know your animals well, and you basically give them monkeys, then you will soon be able to see differences in their behavior, probably in the degree to which they are settled. You'll certainly within 48 hours be able to see a difference in the color of their poo if we're talking about cows, and so you'll be able to spot something. But I mean, if they're in good nick anyway and hale and hearty, you won't see anything much at all. But if they're kind of feeling a bit ropey for whatever reason, you can well see.
And when you say their behaviour, does that go back to their microbiome?
Yeah, absolutely does. Settled stomachs. They want to eat more, that they just aren't pacing about so much. So it's just a sense. So, if you walk into your own barn and with your own cattle, when something's up. You couldn't necessarily explain it, but something's not right. And it's that something that's not right kind of goes missing really when you feed them biochar. So again, how on earth as a scientist do I write that up in an academic paper? I don't. It would just get thrown out. But that finding is absolutely valid, and the only people that can give me that finding, that feedback, are farmers. So again, it goes back to what Liz was saying about we need to minimise this reductionist approach and make far more broader attempt to, to get to be, to include data in all its forms. The fact coming up with purely a chemical answer or purely a number is not always the answer.
I've tried to find the answer to how long it takes, but what I have found out is you can quench the fire with urine if you're interested, because it enhances the nutrient content of the biochar.
Oh well,
nice. Yeah.
Maybe not weeing directly on the burning embers. It's not burning, smouldering embers may not be the idea, but.
Well, I can ask a few PhD students to help us out.
We're in a bucket.
Yeah.
For me, it's reading just that is how it's fitting alongside an understanding of what's happening to soil health, isn't it? It's like an amendment that can help you achieve your soil health objectives.
Yes.
But being clear about, rather than just putting on and seeing what happens, it's having quite a clear objective with what you want to do with it.
Yeah.
And
£800 a ton, it's not something you just can play around with.
No, it's not. And I would never ask demand farmers that they do that. One, they've lost that money and I can't guarantee they get it back. And two, if it's in the ground, it better work because it's not coming back out. And we need to be sensitive to that fact.
So if people want to follow you, or not stalk you, but see what you're up to, not like me, I'm a stalker. How do they kind of find you or watch what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm just through the centre, actually, the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience, and you can see what we're all up to, because none of us operate. The wonderful thing about my job, I'm really lucky, is we don't operate as individuals. We really do bounce off each other. So it's a good idea to follow what the centre is doing. And also, if you're really interested, come and do the MSc with us as well. We have the best time with our MSc students. We learn a huge amount, and I hope like to think they learn a little bit as well.
Oh, Liz has put it in the chat. That's good. Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
So, Nick, what have you learned from this evening?
Well, it was just Donna gives me faith in scientists, because I sometimes when I listen to them. There was one on Radio 4 the other day at Harper Adams. Oh my word! And I think it's just as she explained. Then it's when something is not, when say you go into a group of animals and something's not quite right, or and how do you put that on paper? So you've given me faith that there's people like you out there doing stuff, and also I do worry about the education side. Because I think there's kids. I was talking to a chap at the weekend who's a ag student at a well-known ag university in the north, and it just baffles me what they learn, what they're taught.
Yeah.
And you know that when you've got young minds and you're filling them full of big ag, basically. I just think that's a worry, and it. I think we need to keep highlighting it, Liz. I don't know what we do about it.
Keep going.
Well, we have a student discount for carbon
Oh
calling.
yeah, for carbon calling.
That is a drop in the ocean, but it's something. But and I think it is, and talking to a lot of people, and why they're interested in some of the more regenerative approaches, because it's a lot more exciting. Do you mean it's just you can use your brain a bit more, and there's a lot
it's
more
a
going
skill
on.
set to be proud of. You know, that mustn't be forgotten.
Yeah. And the whole biochar thing, I now know a lot more than I did. One quick question, and it's probably completely not the thing to do, but could you biochar dead things?
What
No.
do you mean, cattle or dead?
There's in the bones, I was thinking. No?
Yes.
No?
They do.
Liz,
Yeah, they
looking at
can
me.
do. I've never experimented with that for a range of complex reasons to do with horrendous admin, not even going there. But yes, absolutely. Certainly insects, biochar, and I wouldn't like to say what else is out there. I've never really looked. I kind of focus on the wood bits only for certain safety risk averse reasons.
My question back to Nick is, why do you want to
No,
biochar
I'll tell you
bones?
why. Because there's loads of dead stuff, and it's collected, isn't it? And it will cost loads to get rid of.
Yeah.
And aren't we just full of carbon? I'm not talking about humans. I'm talking about animals. I don't talk about humans, Liz.
No, but in terms of, from a rendering plant perspective, it does get processed into meat and bone meal, and so some of that burn, or some of it is used depending on species it came from. So it does tend to be processed into something else.
Yeah.
I was thinking more like witchy type thing on your hill in Cumbria. You were going to do some fire dancing around some bones. Who knows?
Well,
I just thought, Nick, I'll be coming your way soon. I might pop in.
Oh, well, do that. Yeah, do that. Oh, Ren will be very excited.
Get your
I don't wish
kiln
to
out.
excite a rugby player. Thank you.
Well, how about you,
Anyway,
Liz? What's your takeaway?
I'm gonna keep my obsession with worms for a bit, and then it might move to biochar with worms.
Okay, yeah.
Because I think the biochar is, the bit I was reading, it's think about it as a coral reef. So it is the structure that the microbes like living in.
That's a really good way of thinking it.
So that is the idea that it's how you can layer different amendments in, I suppose, is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and David White did put on about base being a good alternative education piece. So I think base UK or base ag or something. Yeah. But thank you,
Excellent.
Donna. It's marvelous.
Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome. Really enjoyed it.
And just a brief reminder that the tickets for carbon calling are available. And this is wider than just Donna. Obviously, you're welcome to join. And our plans for the next one is to start doing our ReGen Ag Chats with speakers that we've got set up for the September event. So we'll be back in contact when we've got the next person sorted. But thank you very much, Donna. Thanks, Nick, and we'll see you all soon.
Well, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Donna.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.